Zone, and this is my first attempt at creating a video of our class notes. I'm hopeful that this will be helpful for any of you who were perhaps absent on one of the days that we did notes, or maybe you want to watch and listen again because it'll help you study for a quiz. You should have out your Cornell notes. Be sure to put your name in the upper right-hand corner where it calls for name. Don't forget to put the block when you have science as well as the date. For today, since this is our first set of notes, our topic and objective is Chapter 1, Section 1, the characteristics and needs of living things. So make sure you write that in your notes in the topic and objective section. Next is the essential question. And for today, we're actually going to have two essential questions. The first is, what characteristics do all living things have in common? And the second is, what environmental conditions are necessary to sustain life? Okay, so that goes in the essential question box on your Cornell notes. For the remainder of your note-taking today, you should be only writing in the notes section. Although there is something on the side where there's space for questions, and there's a box at the bottom for a summary. For today, we're just going to be writing in the notes section. So let's begin. We're first going to start with the characteristics of living things. And for our class, we are saying that there are 6 characteristics of living things. Now, if you look online, or maybe you look in another book, you might hear someone say or read that there are 10 characteristics of living things, or maybe there are 5, or somewhere in between those two numbers. But for the purposes of our class, we're going to say that there are 6. And if you really look at all those characteristics on those other sites, they're really saying the same thing. It just depends on how you lump them together. So we're going to start with the first characteristic of living things. And the first is cellular organization. And all that really means is that each living thing is made up of one or more tiny cells. If it does not have a cell, it's not going to be considered alive. And if it is made up of only one cell, we're going to call that a unicellular organism. Unicellular organisms are made up of only one cell. Okay, and an example of a unicellular organism would be a bacterial cell. Oops. Bacteria are unicellular organisms, and here is an example, a little pretty picture of a bacterial cell. If an organism is made up of more than one cell, we are going to say that that is a multicellular organism. So I'm going to put that in there. Multicellular organism is made up of more than one cell. And an example of a multicellular organism is plant. And here is an up-close picture of some beautiful plant cells. Okay, it's important to remember that when you're thinking about the words multi and uni, and maybe you're sitting in our classroom and it's test day, multi is always going to be more complex than uni. If you think about the word multiple, it means more than one. And then if you think about a unicycle has one wheel. Okay, so those are good ways to remember what those words mean. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the second characteristic of living things, and that is the chemicals of life. Certain chemicals are important and necessary for life, and there are 4 that we're going to talk about. Well, there's 5, but we're going to put 2 of them together, so kind of 4 different categories. The first and most abundant chemical is water. Water surprise, surprise, is considered to be a chemical. A lot of people in class seemed shocked by that, but it is considered to be a chemical, and it's the most abundant chemical in cells. And other chemicals have to be dissolved in water in order to get into the cell and get out of the cell. So it's quite important indeed. And here we have a little picture of water, so you know how important it really is. Figured if it has a picture, it must be pretty important. The next chemical, we're going to talk about carbohydrates. Now, for a lot of you, when you hear the word carbohydrates, you might think of bread, pasta, things like that. And while those are carbohydrates, those are not the carbohydrates we're really talking about. I'm going to give you a picture of a glucose molecule. And glucose is a carbohydrate that is synthesized in plants. So, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we do photosynthesis, but that's what we're talking about. We're talking about carbohydrates for energy. Plants create carbohydrates using photosynthesis, and then animals eat those plants, or they eat other animals who have eaten those plants, and they're able to have carbohydrates for energy. The next important chemical for life, and these are the two that we lumped together, are, oops, I did not do that right, I apologize, are proteins and lipids. Proteins and lipids. And those are considered to be the building blocks of cells. We'll go more in detail about that when we look at animal cells and plant cells, but proteins really kind of do everything in life, and you need proteins for every step of function, and lipids provide a lot of structure to cells. Any cell membrane has lipids in it. Okay, so the last one we're going to talk about for chemicals of life are nucleic acids. And you may have heard of nucleic acids when talking about deoxyribonucleic acid, which is the fancy long name for DNA. DNA, which is the genetic code. Okay, so those are the chemicals of life. Let's move back. We have water, carbohydrates, proteins and lipids, and nucleic acids. Okay. The next characteristic of living things, number 3, is response to surroundings. Living things respond to their surroundings. When there's a change in the environment of a living thing, and anything that is outside of that living thing, so if it's a cell, anything outside the cell membrane, or if it's a dog, anything that's not inside the dog is going to be its environment. And a change in the environment is called a stimulus. So if we make that plural, changes in the environment are called stimuli. And for example, change in the amount of light, or sound, or temperature, and organisms must respond to survive. And the example that I gave in class was that if it gets really, really hot out, what do we start to do? And everyone correctly answered that we start to sweat. And I think we were actually sweating in class when we were talking about this because it was really hot. But yes, you start to sweat. And what sweat does, it moistens your skin, and when it starts to dry, it evaporates and it cools you off. And if we didn't do that and it got really hot outside, and we didn't respond by sweating, we could be in big trouble and we could die. So organisms must respond to their surroundings, respond to the stimuli in their environment in order to survive. Number 4 is energy use. All living things require energy. cells need energy to function. And when we're talking about organisms and living things, we can divide those into two categories. Oops. Sorry, I'm fixing that. Cells need energy to function. We can divide that into two categories. The first are called autotrophs. And it's a fancy name. Auto is a word that means self, and troph means nutrition. So autotrophs make their own food for energy, and it sounds really complicated, but if you think about it, plants are autotrophs. They make their own food using the energy from the sun to photosynthesize. And you really don't need to know anything other than that for the purposes of our next assessment. Later on, we'll go over photosynthesis. So once you have autotrophs, and you also have heterotrophs. And heterotrophs eat food for energy as opposed to making it. And once I grab it, you can see that I have the word eat in quotation marks, because when we think of eating, we think of putting things in our mouth and chewing food and swallowing it. But things like bacteria might absorb their nutrition and they don't have a mouth. So that's why eat is in quotation marks. But here is a person actually eating for our little graphic here. And I'm trying to make it smaller. So heterotrophs eat food for energy, and autotrophs make their own food for energy. Moving on, next we have, and this energy, by the way, is used for growing, repairing damage, moving, things like that. I'm sure we talked about this in class that I asked how many people, when they get home from school, their parents complain that they're eating them out of house and home, or maybe they call them a bottomless pit. Well, being teenagers, you're going through a lot of growth, and so you know that it requires a lot more energy, and you're eating probably a whole lot, and there's a good reason for it. Just make sure you're eating the right foods, right? Number 5, the fifth characteristic of living organisms is that they grow and they develop. So number 5 is growth and development. All living things get bigger, growth, and more complex, development, over the course of their lives. So I have growth, whoop, little baby growing up, apparently playing basketball at some point, as far as the picture is concerned. And then we also have development, and putting puzzle pieces together. Much more, it's a little complicated, right? Growth and development. Okay, and the last but not least, living things reproduce. So number 6 is reproduction. Oops. Number 6. Oh no. Apologize. I'm not very good at the editing part, so you'll have to bear with me. I'll get better. 6, reproduction. So living things have to reproduce. And if you think about it, if they didn't reproduce, they wouldn't be a living thing for very long. They would die out pretty quickly. And there are 2 types of reproduction. One is asexual reproduction. In asexual reproduction, there's one parent and the offspring, or the children, if you want to think about it that way, although I doubt you would call bacterial offspring to be children, but those offspring are identical to the parent. So here's a little example. So you see the parent cell over here, and the daughter cell or offspring over here, and they're exactly the same because there was only one parent. So there's not a whole lot of variety there. But then, thank goodness, there came sexual reproduction, which added a lot more variety. And having gene variety is good, as we'll see when we get to our genetics unit. But in sexual reproduction, there are two parents, there are different sets of genes, and the children are not identical to the parents. So I have a little picture here of a mama horse and her baby horse. And while they're both beautiful and running, the mother horse is white and the baby horse is brown. They're not identical. There's different appearance because there's another set of genes in there. Okay, so those are our 6 characteristics of living things. Let's review. Here we go. I'm not making you too dizzy. So 6 characteristics. There's cellular organization. Each living organism is made up of one or more tiny cells. Unicellular organisms are made up of one cell. Multicellular organisms are made up of more than one cell. Remember, multi is more complex than uni. Number 2, chemicals of life. Certain chemicals are important / necessary for life. First is water, the most abundant chemical in cells, and other chemicals must be dissolved in water. Then we have carbohydrates for energy, proteins and lipids, which are the building blocks of cells, and nucleic acids, which provide the genetic code. And you've heard of DNA, which is deoxyribonucleic acid. Okay, number 3, response to surroundings. Changes in the environment are called stimuli. For example, changes in the amount of light, sound, and temperature in organisms must respond to survive. Number 4, energy use. Cells need energy to function, and there are 2 types of organisms when it comes to energy use. The autotrophs make their own food for energy, and heterotrophs eat food for energy. And this energy is used for growing, repairing damage, moving, etc. Number 5, growth and development. All living things get bigger, which is they grow, and more complex. They develop over the course of their lives. And finally, we have reproduction. There's asexual reproduction, where there's one parent and the offspring are identical to the parent. And there is sexual reproduction, where there are 2 parents, different sets of genes, and different appearance. Okay, so now that we have the characteristics of living things, you can see up at your in your essential question box, the second essential question is what environmental conditions are necessary to sustain life? So now we need to look at needs of living things from their environment. Needs of living things from their environment in order for organisms to maintain homeostasis, which sounds really complicated, but all it means is that in order for an organism to maintain stable internal conditions. So going back to the example of heat before, when it gets really hot outside, your body starts sweating. But if it gets too hot outside, your body can't sweat enough in order to cool you off enough to maintain stable internal conditions, and perhaps certain vital organs could start shutting down. So what do organisms need from their environment in order to stay alive? Number 1 is temperature, like we were just talking about. Temperature. Organisms need proper temperature so that its atoms and molecules move at the right speed. They move too slowly because perhaps it's too cold. They will freeze and die. If they move too quickly, they'll overheat when it's too hot. And it's been determined that negative 15 degrees Celsius, negative 15 degrees Celsius to 115 degrees Celsius is the proper temperature for life to sustain on Earth. So if you look at that, negative 15 degrees Celsius is about 5 degrees Fahrenheit, which maybe doesn't seem too cold, especially living in Maine where it's been 5 degrees Fahrenheit, and maybe you feel quite fine. But you also have coats on, and you have warm homes, hopefully, warm schools to go to. So if you were outside at 5 degrees Fahrenheit, how long could you really live? Um, Probably not that long, but there are organisms that do live that long without having the benefits of wood stoves and things like that. 115 degrees Celsius is 239 degrees Fahrenheit, which is quite warm, but there are organisms like near the thermal vents in the bottom of the ocean that do live at those conditions, and we'll talk about that a little bit next week. Okay, so we have temperature. What else do living things need from their environment? Well, we've talked about this before, and it can't be said enough. Living things need water. This is number 2. Water dissolves and transports chemicals and has to be in liquid form. So if there's no water, there cannot be life. And those of you who maybe follow the Mars rover, looking for signs of water on Mars, well, if there's water, it's possible that there could be life. But as far as we know now, nothing can live without water. Okay, number 3. Living organisms need atmosphere. Atmosphere traps heat, shields from harmful rays, and provides the right gases such as oxygen. So if you think about it, the moon, forget the fact that there's not water, it doesn't have atmosphere, even though it's just as close to the sun as we are, closer at times. It doesn't have an atmosphere, so it can't trap heat, it doesn't shield from harmful rays, and it can't provide the right gases like oxygen. Okay, and we've said the next one, number 4. We've talked about this before, but again, from its environment, living things require energy. Light from the sun or chemicals from an energy source. When we were talking about in class, I reminded everybody that the ultimate source of energy is the sun. So think about it. Chemicals from an energy source. I'll change this. Chemicals from energy source. If you're getting chemicals from an energy source, so you're eating a plant, that's your energy source. The energy in that plant was created because the sun exists, and the sun helped that plant perform photosynthesis. So the ultimate source of energy is the sun, and that is necessary for life. And last but not least, and this goes hand in hand with energy, is nutrients. Without an intake of nutrients, you wouldn't have energy, right? And living things would not have energy to perform the necessary things to stay alive, like reproduce, move, grow, and develop. Okay, so let's review that again. The needs of living things from their environment. In order for organisms to maintain stable internal conditions or homeostasis, are temperature, so that an organism's atoms and molecules move at the right speed, and they've determined that correct temperature, the range, is negative 15 degrees Celsius to 115 degrees Celsius. Number 2, water, which dissolves and transports chemicals and must be in liquid form. Number 3, atmosphere, which traps heat, shields from harmful rays, provides right gases such as oxygen. 4, energy, light from sun or chemicals from an energy source, which is ultimately going to be the sun, because that's where those chemicals are going to be synthesized by a plant that is using sunlight. And number 5 is nutrients. And again, nutrients and energy go hand in hand. Okay, so those are your notes. And I hope this is helpful, and any feedback would be extremely helpful to me so that I know what works and what doesn't. Good luck with your notes, and if you come see me in class, we can talk about what kind of questions should be in your margins, and we can work on summaries. Excellent. Have a great day.